Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Pipetting with Purpose, Steps Towards More Sustainable Labs. I am Cassie Saltman of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots and brought to you by Sartorius. To learn more, visit www.sartorius.com. We encourage you to participate today by submitting any questions you may have during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Submit. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. Also, if you experience any technical issues, you can utilize this Q&A box and we will assist you directly. I'd like to now welcome our speakers. Raj Patey, Business Development Director at My Green Labs, and Maria Voutilainen, Product Manager, Liquid Handling Consumables at Sartorius. Maria, you may now begin your portion of the presentation.
Okay, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and welcome to everybody from my behalf as well. So really nice to see so many of you here listening to this webinar, Pipetting with Purpose, Steps Towards More Sustainable Labs. So let's have a little bit of a look about the agenda that we are going to have today. So first, Raj from My Green Lab is going to be discussing about building a global culture of sustainability in science and introducing the ACT eco-label. And then I'm going to continue discussing about sustainability at Sartorius, our pipette tips, and then circle back to the ACT eco-label. And then finally discuss about liquid handling and how sustainable practices can be brought into your lab. But okay, for now, I'll give the stage to Raj from My Green Lab. Go ahead, Raj.
Thanks, Maria. And yes, my name's Raj Patey from Impact Laboratories, which is a subsidiary of My Green Lab. And we're going to be talking a lot about some of the My Green Lab programs today and our collaboration with Sartorius, which we're very pleased to be part of as well. So yes, building a global culture of sustainability in science, that's our mission statement actually. But what does it mean to you? Well, if you're in a lab, maybe it's about how you integrate sustainability into your lab processes, your next experiment design, things like that. If you're maybe someone who designs lab products or buys lab products, it's about how sustainability sits alongside things like quality and performance and price, and is therefore part of what you do on a day-to-day basis. And that culture word is also really important to us because culture is something, for example, that doesn't leave an organization when one person changes role or leaves. If that's the case, then it wasn't culture. So we're really looking to build this global culture of sustainability in science. And you may ask, well, why the focus on laboratories and labs? Well, in a world where whether you're in a pharmaceutical, a biotech, a university, or all the other wealth of areas where there are labs involved, labs are very intensive when it comes to their energy usage, their water usage, and their generation of plastic, chemical, and other waste. So in comparison to, for example, office spaces, there are areas of both positive work and also areas for much positive change when it comes to reducing carbon footprints or reducing environmental impact. So what do we at My Green Lab do on a day-to-day basis to actually help you with this? Well, we operate a range of programs. We're not going to talk about all of them today. We're going to dive into some details on a few of them, especially the ACT Eco-Label program. But really, one of the things we really believe in is that to achieve our mission, we need to work across the industry in a collaborative way, which is why we have programs, for example, in the middle that are around advocacy and education, because everything starts with awareness. At the top, we have programs around certification, one which is more about lab process and behaviors, one which is more about lab products. And at the bottom, we have a couple of things that are more about wider engagement, whether it's about funding in the research environment when it comes to the Million Advocates for Sustainable Science campaign, or whether it's about our global collaboration with the United Nations Climate Champions team and our programs being part of the UN Race to Zero. And if you want to learn anything more about anything we covered today and anything you see mentioned on this slide, just go to mygreenlab.org and you'll find lots of very useful and interesting information. But to get into a bit of detail on some of these, if you're new to laboratory sustainability, or maybe if you're not, one place that many people start their journey in laboratory sustainability and with My Green Lab is the My Green Lab Ambassador Program. This is free to access. The only investment you're making is about an hour or so of your time. And it's designed for scientists, but also people who work in sales, marketing, procurement, and every other role in the laboratory supply chain and the laboratory usage chain, to in that hour or so give you an introduction to the areas it says at the bottom: energy, water, waste, green chemistry, and what we call community, which is really about engaging in your lab environment. And through the fun online videos, you get an introduction to laboratory sustainability and how to start solving some of the issues around it. And we ask you to bring those back to your lab and become a MyGreen Lab ambassador. And when you've done that, you become part of an online community where you can share ideas with others around the world. And there are things like monthly speakers as well. And having done that, you become part of this global community. And actually now, if we come out to June 2024, that's over 7,500 ambassadors. So wherever you are on your laboratory sustainability journey, I like to think this map really drives home that your colleagues, your collaborators, your customers, etc., wherever they are in the world, are really investing hard in thinking about how to run labs in a more green and sustainable way. And if, having done the ambassador program, you want to take it a bit further, that's where My Green Lab certification comes in. My Green Lab certification is the world's leading green lab certification program that covers 14 key areas. You'll see them on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide there. Obvious things like energy through to more advanced things like green chemistry. And over a period of 8 to 10 months, first baselines the behaviors in the labs, and then provides you lots of feedback and information to guide you to running your labs in a more green and sustainable way. And at the end of that process, you are now recognized on a globally recognized scale and part of another big community globally. And for information, if you look at all these dots on here, this is roughly speaking 40 to 45% biotech and pharma companies, around 40% academic labs, and the other 20% or so is made up of other sectors where there are wet labs, such as cosmetics, food and beverage, agrochem, and clinical and healthcare as a growth area as well. And of course, you might ask, well, what are the benefits to this program? Well, there's lots and lots of benefits, but here's just one example. And we have many other case studies we can share with you if you want to get in touch. But in this case, you see this company's worked through the program. They've implemented massive savings in water, in waste, and they've actually been certified to the highest level. And as I said, we can share examples from academia, pharma, and some of the other examples may highlight energy savings or chemical savings. But the point is these relate to reduced environmental impact, reduced cost, and more. So having talked about how you can get your journey started, how you can change your laboratory processes, let's start to think more about laboratory products, which is the key focus here today. But before we do that, just a little bit of data, and you can find more about this on our website. As part of our collaboration with the United Nations Climate Champions team, we release a study each year which looks at the carbon impact, in this case, of the biotech and pharma industry. And I'm going to use a couple of words. So if you're not familiar, this is a very common diagram you'll find online in many places, actually. When we talk about scopes of carbon impact in any arena, including the laboratory arena, you might hear us talk about scope 1. Scope 1 is what we call your direct carbon emissions. They're things like your facilities and your vehicles. Scope 2, you start to move into your indirect things like the electricity you purchase to run your heating and steam generation in labs and cooling and things like that. And scope 3 is everything else and includes things like your supply chain, employee community, business travel, and lots of other things as well. Now, this study is actually very in-depth and you can find it online, but a couple of headlines from it. When we look at this data set, which represents a good portion of the biotechnology and pharmaceuticals industry, but not all of it, it's actually similar in size to industries like forestry and paper and the semiconductor industry, both that would be considered giant high-impact arenas. So it's a big and growing impact area. And when we look at that scope 3, the everything else scope, if you like, and we look at what that's made up of, in this sector, purchased goods and services represents a very high percentage you'll see there. And by the way, the other columns there are really to give you examples versus other industries, just to kind of sanity check the data and show you where it's at. And we have private and public companies listed there for biotechnology and pharmaceuticals. But the take-home point here really is that for this industry, A, carbon impact is very high, and B, it's dominated by purchased goods and services, i.e. supply chain. Of course, going in to make things like drugs by pharmaceuticals, but also a lot going into R&D and QC in areas like that. where laboratories are concerned. So it's really important that as an industry, we collaborate between labs, lab suppliers, and wider as well. And with that in mind, and to finish off a little bit, let's talk a bit more about products. So I like to use this conversation as what is a sustainable product? Here's a mobile phone. Everyone has one in their pocket, on their desk or whatever. They're familiar with it. And I might say to you, if we were in a live room now and we're all in front of each other, I might say, put your hand up. What is a sustainable laboratory product? And you might say things like, oh, it's the one with the lowest energy consumption. Great thing to mention for something like a laboratory freezer, for example. You might say, is it recyclable with plastics in mind? You might say, does it contain toxic chemicals? There's been lots in the news about PFAS and all sorts of other things in the last year. You might say, does it last a long time? Single use versus multi-use versus equipment that lasts a long time is a good consideration. You might ask about its manufacturing process. Where does the energy come from for the factory? Is it made from sustainable materials or virgin materials? Has the factory been updated to be more efficient and less energy and waste consuming, for example? And is it locally made? That often comes up with regard to food, for example. How does it apply to other products? And at the end of its life, just like recyclability is a question, does it end up in landfill? Does it get thrown away? Does it need to be incinerated, etc.? And really the take-home point here is that when we think about this question, what is a sustainable product? Or what is a sustainable lab product, as we're going to come on to? Really what we're encouraging here is this holistic or circular approach to thinking about product sustainability. It's not just about energy or about recyclability or about materials. It's about looking at a product from all these angles and therefore looking for areas of improvement and areas of differentiation as well. So with that in mind, that's where the ACT Eco Label comes in, which is our final program to talk about today. The ACT Eco Label, like it says here, is a bit like a nutrition label. You all may be familiar with in the supermarket, those nutrition labels in the UK and Europe, they're very color coded. I think in the US, they're there, but they're more white. But the point is that they take the complex subject of nutrition and they look to present it to you in a simple to understand, sometimes color coded, but standardized approach. ACT is looking to do the same thing, but with product sustainability information for the laboratory sector. Similarly, the other reason I like this analogy is those nutrition labels are not a stamp to say your food is healthy, are they? Depending on the scores they depict, they could be something very unhealthy or very healthy. ACT equally, in an age where things like the EU Claims Directive, for example, is directing us to really think hard about what greenwashing is not a rubber stamp to say something is green. It provides a range of metrics and measurements in a standardized and transparent way so that you can do what I like to call sometimes informed procurement and be on that journey of improvement with your suppliers. But before you even think about the label that you saw on the last screen, there's 3 words here. ACT is an acronym. What does it really mean? Well, ACT is about manufacturers demonstrating to their customers that they are accountable for the environmental impact of their products and for reducing it over time. Consistency is about the fact the product is being evaluated and measured to a standardized process that is the same for chemicals, consumables, reagents, and equipment big and small. And it's the same for Sartorius and every other manufacturer out there as well. So it's truly standardized. And transparency, I like to think of the wrapper around all of this. Transparency is that people are sharing with you what they're great at, also what they're not maybe so great at. But through engaging in this process, they're working through a journey improvement with you, the consumer of their products. And when we look at an actual label, you see here a range of information. I'm not going to dive into massive detail, but get in touch if you want to find out more, take a look at the website, etc. But you see, broadly speaking, we have 3 main areas. We first, in the manufacturing section, looking at things like energy and waste at the factory, things like for the products and the packaging, where do the materials come from? Are they from virgin sources, recycled source, other sustainable sources? In the usage phase, if it's a bit of equipment, how much energy and water does it consume? For all products, is it single use, multi-use? Does it last many years? And at the end of life of the product, what happens to it in the packaging? Do they end up in landfill? Can they be recycled, repurposed, reused in some way? And most of these numbers, other than energy and water, on a scale of 1 to 10. So you're looking for the lower numbers, the ones in green, the color coding is important, and less so the red numbers. But most importantly, you're looking for manufacturers who are demonstrating that accountability, consistency, and transparency. And if you want to start looking at some of these labels, if you go to act.mygreenlab.org, you'll find a database of all these labels. You should also expect to see them in marketing material at exhibition booths, on web pages of manufacturers, but you will see products from all the manufacturers you see represented here. There's about 35, I think, on screen at the moment. And ACT is actually growing really fast at the moment. And by the end of the year, you'll see over 50 manufacturers represented there and pushing towards 2,000 products, and probably more actually realistically by the end of the year represented there. So it's a great time to start using this program and being part of it as well. And if you want any reassurance of what people are thinking about in labs, there's a great survey that Agilent did in partnership with Frost & Sullivan back in 2023. And you see here they surveyed 500 lab managers, they had in-depth conversations with 100 lab decision makers. And the stats speak for themselves, really. 82% of labs surveyed have already adopted sustainability measures. 85% of those surveys expect their vendors to support them in reaching their sustainability goals now and in the future. And 91% of respondents value an independent certification of green labeled products. So to finish off, just a few reminders. Use ACT if you're a consumer in the lab. Use ACT to choose products. Use ACT to engage with your suppliers and talk with your suppliers. Break down those boundaries. Let them know that you as an individual in your organization have goals around reducing environmental impact, and things like ACT allow that to be done in a transparent ways. Use things like ACT in RFQs, bids, framework agreements. Use the ACT database, act.mygreenlab.org, to look at products and information. Top tip on the ACT database, having clicked on a product label, scroll down the page and you'll find some extra information that you'll find useful. And set an example, become a My Green Lab ambassador. It's just an hour or so of your time at no cost. Consider things like My Green Lab certification for your lab. And remember that it's all about being on a journey of improvement. Don't be the person, the organization, the company or whatever who says, we'll look at this when we're perfect next year. Start taking small steps, and over time we can solve complex problems. And focus on the positives. Yes, every pipette tip in the world is made of virgin polypropylene, but that's not to say there can't be a massive differentiation between one pipette tip and another, depending on how it's wrapped, how it's packaged, how it's manufactured, the energy that goes into the factory, and all these other areas, and be part of that Green Labs community. And I'll finish off with a great quote here that says, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only way that ever has. On that note, I'll say thank you, and I'll hand back to Maria and look forward to answering your questions a bit later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Raj. That was very interesting topics that you were discussing. So now let's continue with sustainability here at Sartorius. So sustainability is important for all of us on an individual level, but it is also one of the core values for Sartorius. We are constantly implementing sustainable practices into our operations and choosing partners that share these values. We are aiming to provide all of you products and services that enable prioritizing sustainability instead of making compromises when it comes to it. Sartorius has several concrete climate action targets, for example, which can be divided to short, mid, and long term. For example, for the midterm targets, we are looking to reduce our CO2 emissions intensity and to switch to 100% renewable electricity. The long-term goal is for Sartorius to reach net zero CO2 emissions and to decarbonize the entire supply chain in collaboration with our suppliers and you, our customers. We are also concentrating on resources and circularity, which means that we are aiming to minimize waste and to overall optimize and reduce resource use. This means that we are creating products that are durable, can be reused when possible, repaired to extend their lifetime, and in the end, safely and efficiently recycled. When possible, we are aiming to use materials from renewable and recycled resources, and in the future, to have zero operational waste going to landfill. And then a few words about Sartorius pipette tips. The actual use of any product is only one part of the entire story of that given product. Before you have the pipette tip attached to your pipette, there has already been several steps on its journey. Lifecycle thinking is an approach that is essential at Sartorius. We are constantly seeking ways for advancing sustainability and assessing the environmental footprint of a product all the way from the raw materials to its disposal. We are continuously refining our production methods to increase efficiency, reduce waste, and lower energy consumption. We consider the implications of shipping and look for ways to optimize our entire logistics chain to minimize carbon emissions, as all of these steps play a part in the environmental impact of a product. We have already performed life cycle screenings for several of our products to gain a better understanding of their individual environmental footprint. These screenings also offer us very good insights about where to focus our efforts and what to consider when developing new products that are more sustainable. Here in the map, on the right-hand side, you can see where Kajaani, a town in northern Finland, is located. Right now, it's not so snowy as it is in the picture. Summer has actually arrived there as well, and last week when I was visiting the factory, it was really nice and sunny. But besides the snow in winter and lovely summer presently, Kajaani is also the home of Sartorius pipette tips, and this is where almost all of the tips are manufactured. We have quite a variety of different tips available in our portfolio, but roughly these tips can be divided in two product families, which are the standard OptiFit tips and filtered safety space tips. The OptiFit tips are available in various packaging options and purity options, which gives each laboratory a possibility to consider which tip variants are the most optimal choice for their specific applications when considering the requirements for purity, usability, and sustainability. The safety space filter tips, on the other hand, are aimed for most purity demanding applications and are always certified to be free of common contaminants such as DNAs, RNAs, human DNA, and endotoxins. These tips always come as pre-sterilized as well. The available volumes ranges from 10 microliter up to 10 milliliter macro tips. But now, let's have a look at the manufacturing of these tips in more detail and what steps we have already taken to ensure that the environmental impact of these tips remains as small as possible. Our environmental management system is certified by independent third party to meet the ISO 14001 standard. This means that we are committed not only to regulatory compliance, but also to continuous improvement and sustainable development of our operations. Our production facility is operated with 100% renewable electricity. The waste heat from production is redirected to provide heating for the manufacturing facility, thereby reducing the consumption of district heat. Additionally, we have upgraded all the lighting to LED lights, which has reduced energy consumption, for example, in our warehouse building by up to 30%. The plastic raw materials used for manufacturing the pipette tips are stored in silos and purchased in bulk, which contributes to reduced packaging waste and transportation emissions. The manufacturing process itself has been enhanced by gradually upgrading to cutting-edge technology that reduces the amount of plastic waste. The generated plastic production waste is collected by a local recycling company, and the recycled plastic is then repurposed to use as raw materials for other plastic products. Altogether, our tip manufacturing site has achieved a total waste recovery rate of 98%, which means that hardly any waste ends up as landfill. In addition to this, Sartorius manufacturing and office facilities in Finland have partnered with local carbon-neutral waste management service. The carbon footprint produced by our waste management is always measured, and the CO2 emissions are offset through certified afforestation projects. For example, last year we invested in permanent carbon sinks to neutralize our waste emissions. But let's also take a moment to consider the product design and production process in more detail. The quality of any consumable is linked to their initial design and manufacturing. A pipette and its corresponding tip constitute an integrated system which is designed to function seamlessly together. When Sartorius pipettes are paired with either OptiFit or safety space filter tips, they achieve their full intended performance. The manufacturing process of Sartorius chips involves the use of diamond polished molds, which produces chips with a consistently smooth surface. This smoothness is critical in minimizing liquid retention within the tip, which in turn facilitates precise and accurate dispensing of liquids. The compatibility between the pipette and the tip and the overall quality of the manufacturing process is of great importance for ensuring reliable and reproducible results, meaning you will have less variation in your pipetting results from sample to sample. And this in turn minimizes the need for unnecessary pipetting repetitions, thereby reducing the overall usage of pipette tips. On the right-hand side, you can see a comparison of Sartorius tips and few other pipette tips from other manufacturers, which shows that even the standard tips do have differences when it comes to liquid retention properties. Utilizing high-quality tips ensures that less liquid is retained within the tip with each dispense, and this, of course, ensures high-quality results. Next, let's continue to the packaging of the tips. Packaging, of course, has critical role in maintaining the integrity and quality of the tips. For Sartorius pipette tips, there are several different packaging options for different laboratory needs. One of the key things is to evaluate which packaging options are the most suitable ones for your specific applications. Because not all workflows require the highest purity, which is typically associated with single rack products, and for those applications, also other packaging formats could be considered. So, in addition to single racks, our offerings include refill tower, where the individual tip trays are stacked to a tower format, refill single pack, and bulk options. And all of these three options enable you to reuse empty tip boxes in your lab. And this way, you can significantly decrease both the volume of plastic waste generated and also extend the lifetime of single tip box that you already have in your lab. On the right-hand side, you can see the comparison of different packaging formats, and as you can see, the amount of plastic that you can save by opting to use other packaging formats than single rack is quite significant. The OptiFit refill trays and bulk tips are designed to be fully compatible with Sartorius tip boxes across the entire product range, and the tip boxes and trays can withstand repeated autoclaving, thereby ensuring extended purity and expanding the scope of applications for refill and bulk tips. If we look a bit more about the amount of plastic in these different packaging variants, you can see that the plastic reduction, as I said, is quite significant, with as high as 70% with the flexible and 50% with the refill tower. Also, the refill single pack is a great option when higher purity is required, as these are available also as pre-sterilized versions and yet have a lower plastic content in the packaging. However, the environmental impact of these products is not only tied to the reduction of plastic and waste. When the tips are packed, for example, to refill tower, those same tips have a much smaller total product footprint. This also means that more product can be transported at one go. For example, with the refill tower, 3 times more of the product can be transported, which then of course means less emissions originating from the transport. And overall, when it comes to logistics of our pipette tips, we prioritize sustainability by favoring overland and sea freight options over air cargo. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of recycling and how it plays a crucial role in reducing carbon footprint of our products. Our pipette tips and tip boxes are made from 100% polypropylene, a material that is fully recyclable, provided it has not come into contact with hazardous substances. This means that under the right conditions, these components can be reprocessed and given a new life rather than ending up as landfill waste or incinerated. However, the recycling of pipette tips, tip boxes and trays is always subject to local regulations and laboratory practices. And while we encourage recycling, we do recognize that it may not always be feasible. But for those products that have remained uncontaminated, they can be treated as plastic waste and recycled accordingly. And then additionally, the cardboard packaging that houses our products is also 100% recyclable and FSC certified cardboard. And some of our cardboard packaging also incorporates recycled content. But liquid handling is obviously not only about the consumables. The pipettes have a role here as well. As pipettes are not single-use items, they should be cleaned, maintained and serviced on a regular basis. This practice can extend the lifetime of your pipette by several years. Therefore, we always recommend setting up a cleaning maintenance program to ensure this is done regularly. We have service and spare parts available for all our pipettes, and this ensures that you can avoid the need to prematurely buy a new pipette because your old pipette broke down and nobody will fix it. When the pipette eventually reaches end of life, Sartorius service can offer proper disposal of the pipette and its components to ensure that it's done in an environmentally friendly manner. Okay, and now let's circle back to the topic that Raj already mentioned, so the ACT Eco-label, which we have recently received for our refill tower. So in order to have more visibility and transparency for our manufacturing practices, we have started this wonderful collaboration with MyGreenLab. And we have already received our first ACT Eco-label for our refill towers. And here on the right-hand side, you can see an example of one of the labels for one of the refill towers. And as Raj already mentioned, all these labels are gathered in the ACT label database. So if you just Google ACT label database, you will find all these different labels, and you can find more information about the different aspects that are covered within the label, and of which I have been discussing also during this webinar. So please remember to go check it afterwards. And then as a final topic, let's move to liquid handling and sustainable practices, and something that anybody can do in their own lab. So sustainability, this can be extended also to pipetting practices. So when you are using proper equipment, here pipettes, and you have good understanding about their maintenance, the compatibility of tips with pipettes and proper pipetting techniques, you can really reduce the number of tips you use during experiments. So firstly, pipettes are precision instruments that demand regular maintenance and calibration to ensure they deliver accurate and precise results. Without proper calibration, a pipette is simply not reliable, and it may introduce unwanted variability into your experiments. It's crucial to establish a maintenance schedule that reflects the frequency and type of use for each pipette. So if you have a pipette that is used very often by many people, it's more likely that it will need more frequent maintenance. Moving on, the pipettes and the tip, these are a system. A perfect match between the tip and the pipette is essential for correct seal. This is most often guaranteed when both the pipette and the tips come from the same manufacturer, as the tips are specifically designed for that pipette. A proper seal is critical, and without it, you can have issues like leakage, micro leakage, or even tips detaching from the pipette. And then lastly, avoiding common pipetting errors. Mechanical pipettes in particular require skilled hand, it's much like handwriting. A person's pipetting technique is unique and can influence the pipetting outcome. And then additionally, understanding where variation in pipetting actually comes from is crucial for proper pipetting results. And I'll briefly introduce some of these sources of variation in this next slide. So these different sources of pipetting errors are listed here. So, for example, if you are reusing tips several times, if you don't, for example, wipe the tip wall to the vessel wall after using it, if you don't pre-wet the tip, or if you have, for example, uneven rhythm or uneven piston movement when you are pipetting. All of these things can actually affect your end results. It may seem that these percentages that you can see here are not very huge, only 0.5 to 4%, but consider that all of these things are actually cumulative. So all of these things can happen during single experiment. And if all of this variation is introduced into your experiment, you might end up with really strange results. So it is very important to be aware of these things so you can avoid them. So then few words about planning and how this can affect the amount of tip waste generated. So well planned is obviously half done. This is so true for any laboratory experiment. Not only does thorough planning impact the time spent conducting an experiment, but it also influences the amount of consumables used. So imagine this very simplified hypothetical setup where you have, for example, 5 reagents and 10 samples that need to be transferred to a microplate. There are several ways to accomplish this, each yielding the same result, but the number of pipette tips used can vary greatly. So, what questions should we ask during the planning stage? Well, first, consider the application's requirements. Does it demand high purity? Do the tips need to be sterile, or is non-sterile an option? Could reusable labware be a viable option as well? What type of consumables are necessary? And also consider the level of accuracy and precision needed. Is it essential to dispense each drop, or could a less precise method of transferring liquids be adequate for this application? So when you are using a pipette, consider when you must change the tip to avoid contaminating your samples or reagents. Could you perhaps employ master mixes at one point for the reagents to streamline the process? If you find yourself changing the tip for each reagent and pipetting them individually, not only is this time consuming, but it also leads to significant increase in tip usage. So by utilizing a master mix and transferring it with a single tip and then using 1 tip per sample, you can reduce tip usage by over 70%. And while the difference may seem smaller for a single experiment, consider the cumulative effect again. If multiple people in your lab repeat this experiment several times a day. Annually, the savings in tips and by extension the cost can already be quite huge. So in the end, this approach where you carefully plan ahead and consider the requirements of the specific application not only minimizes waste but also contributes to long-term savings, both financial and time-wise. And then finally, we have gone through several topics during this webinar. So briefly to summarize different aspects. So first of all, when you're considering consumables, always remember that high quality consumables, they do really give you more reliable results. You can always consider the packaging options because those can really reduce the amount of plastic waste that you generate in the lab. And always remember that recycling, when possible, it really reduces the environmental footprint of the product. The ACT Ecolabel database is a wonderful source of information about your consumables. And then when it comes to instruments, it's very important to remember that you have to maintain and calibrate your pipettes. And always be mindful about the pipetting techniques because these really affect your end results a lot. And always remember to choose the consumables that really match with the pipette because this way you can guarantee that you will really have high quality results. And then what you can do as an individual, always carefully plan your experiments, evaluate the application needs, and then also share the best practices with your colleagues. And then obviously give feedback to the manufacturers such as Sartorius about the consumables and sustainable efforts that you would need. And with this, I say thank you to everybody who have been participating in this webinar, and many thanks to Raj as well from my Green Lab. And I look forward to replying to all of the questions that you might now have. Many thanks.
Thank you, Raj and Maria, for your informative presentations. We will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question box located at the far left of your screen. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for today. Let's go ahead and get started. Our first question is for Maria. This question says, I'm curious about how long we can expect a pipette to last. Also, how often should we be calibrating these tools to ensure accuracy?
Okay, really good question. Well, first about how long can we expect a pipette to last? So what is the lifetime of the pipette? Actually, in our service, we see plenty of pipettes that are over 10 years old. So a pipette, it's really not something that you use only for a couple of years. So if you take good care of it, you have annual service and maintenance for it, you really can extend the lifetime of the pipette by several years and have it for example, for over 10 years. Then about how often it should be calibrated was the second part, I think. So the calibration is, of course, extremely important for accurate and precise pipetting results. So the short answer would be that you have to calibrate your pipette at least annually. But this, of course, depends on the type of use and also about the precision requirements that you have for your experiments. So if high precision is needed, then of course calibration might be necessary more often. Then of course there are also like situations, for example, if the pipette has been dropped or damaged in any way, then it should always be recalibrated. And then also if you're using liquids that are very corrosive, for example, so those can have an effect on the pipette itself. So it can those type of liquids can also corrode and clog the pipette. So that means that you have to have more maintenance for the pipette, which then would mean that you would have to have calibration afterwards. So it really depends on the usage, the type of liquids and these sort of things.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, our next question here looks like is for you, Raj. It says, what drove My Green Lab to come up with the ACT label?
Great question. So historically, My Green Lab started actually, and a lot of our work was around things like the My Green Lab certification program that I mentioned, which was all about that behavioral change in the lab space. But what we realized as time went on, and when we looked at things like some of the carbon data around the impact of biotech and pharma, was to use a phrase that we use sometimes, is that you can't have a sustainable lab without a sustainable lab supply chain as well. So, and then when we went out and chatted to people in labs, people in procurement, people at manufacturers, etc., we realized there was no real standardized approach. Whilst you could go into the supermarket and see standardized approaches, things like food labeling, in the laboratory industry, when it came to sustainability, there was no standard. And hence the ACT label was born. And it was driven by a stakeholder-led process of people in procurement, people in the lab, people at manufacturers, with that aim really of going from not just changing lab process and behavior of some of our other programs to helping people look at their supply chain and pick more sustainable products, but really importantly, help manufacturers drive to more sustainability through continuous improvement as well.
Excellent, thank you. All right, our next question here, back to you, Maria. This question says, you mentioned life cycle analysis earlier. I was wondering, where do pipette tips have the biggest environmental impact?
Good question. So if we are considering the impact of pipette tips and the entire life cycle, so then it would be the raw materials that are used for manufacturing the tips. So there's a clear difference between the CO2 footprint of bulk and refill tips in comparison to racked tips that come with the tip box. So the difference comes simply from the amount of raw material and then from the eventual disposal of the product. So if you have more plastic there, then the higher impact will also be for the disposal of the product. Actually, in the end, for example, the impact of packaging materials. So in this case, the cardboard packaging, which houses the tip boxes, for example, it's fairly small, which also reflects the fact that the environmental impact of the cardboard in general is much smaller than it is for plastic. But of course, the total environmental footprint comes from all of these different sections, the raw materials to shipping to disposal. So everything plays its own part, but raw materials and disposal are the biggest ones.
course. Thank you. We're going to pass it back over to you, Raj, with our next question. This question asks, product sustainability takes in so many areas which can seem daunting. Do you have any thoughts or tips on the challenge?
Yeah, agree 100%. Product sustainability, behavioral change, all these things are indeed challenges and can be daunting. I think the number one thing I'd say is don't be afraid to start taking small steps. I like to sometimes think about it as if we keep taking many, many small steps, eventually before we know it, we've solved a very complex question. So rather than standing back and fearing that situation, just think, and so for example, when people go through the ACT label process, part of that is they receive feedback. And they might get feedback on packaging, on materials, on manufacturing. Start with something and then build up over time. Whatever you do, don't be afraid of change, though.
Yes, perfect. All right, we have our next question here. This one is a little bit long, so bear with me. This question says, beyond economic factors, what are the psychological barriers that prevent researchers from readily adopting sustainable lab practices, and how can ingrained habits, fear of jeopardizing data integrity, or lack of awareness be effectively addressed to promote widespread behavioral change?
I can take that one if you like, or Maria?
Yeah, I think this is probably something we both can say something about. I think I could at least say that there's already a clear shift towards more sustainable practices in laboratories. For sure, there's more interest about sustainable practices, and I think everybody can do their part. And the fact that you are participating in the webinar and learning more about sustainable practices already tells a lot about the need and the willingness to make that change. And as Raj said, it doesn't have to be one huge leap. You can do this step by step and build on that. Raj, you can maybe continue from there.
Yeah, sure. So I think in the question there was the word awareness there, and as Maria has alluded to there, everything starts with awareness. So, for example, take a look at the Migreen Lab Ambassador program I mentioned during the presentation. It's just an hour of your time, but whether you're in the lab, whether you're making things for the lab, etc., you might walk away from that. In fact, I'm sure you'll walk away from that with some great ideas about how to start making just some small changes, doing those small steps, etc. And yeah, I agree with the point in the question as well, that that's one way I think of it. Sometimes science is funny because science is all about advancing things and making the world a better place. But scientists can sometimes be very conservative and, well, we've always followed this process, we've always done it this way. So think of it like another science exercise. It's an experiment, isn't it? Try a new approach, try new products, etc. Test it out, test the hypothesis. When it works, which it probably will, then amplify that and do more and more of it. And also use your community and your peers as well. So through things like our ambassador community, through your colleagues in your own organization or at your university, for example, learn lessons from each other. Because the other thing I'd say is sometimes scientists think, well, my lab's special or my lab's different. In a lot of labs, a lot of these things are the same challenges and the same differences. So learn lessons from each other as well.
And always also give feedback about the sustainable things that you need in your laboratory. So you can always give feedback, for example, for us at Sartorius about what you would need to be more sustainable.
And if I can add one other thing, actually, I think the beginning of the question was economic factors. So beyond economic factors, it's really great to hear someone say beyond economic factors, because economic factors is sometimes given as we can't do this. But I think there's also a misnomer sometimes that sustainable approaches are more costly approaches. Yes, maybe sometimes there'll be a little bit of extra upfront investment in a different product or a different process. But it's also borne out, and I think I mentioned in the presentation through some case studies, and we can share more if people get in touch, that more sustainable labs, for example, are often labs that in the long term are saving a lot in terms of maybe energy costs or waste disposal costs or chemical usage, for example, and things like this. So yeah, so look at the total return on investment in changes alongside everything else we talked about as well.
Exactly, planning the experiments to reduce the amount of consumables, for example, and things like this.
Excellent. Thank you both for that answer here. We have another question. It looks like another a little bit lengthy one. So let me start out with this. Can you provide a detailed comparison of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production, use, and disposal of pipette tips made from various materials, e.g. polypropylene, biodegradable plastics, glass?
We do not have exact information about this available at this time. As I said, we have done some life cycle analysis screenings already for our products that we have available, and hopefully we will have materials to share about these findings later on. But beyond that, we do not have exact comparisons available at this time yet.
Yeah, and
but
I just add that. So yeah,
always
sorry, go on.
Yes, yeah, sorry. And just to add on that it's really excellent to ask about these things because this is the way that these are made available.
Wonderful.
And yeah, I'll just add to that I think, yeah, as an industry, we're working towards those detailed data points. And in fact, the ACT label program, as it develops in the coming years, you'll see more and more granularity in this type of information. But I'd also like to emphasize that whilst these perfect, if you like, data points are important to aim at and important to get to, what's really importantly, as we convert our industry into thinking more about this area, is to look at these life cycle approaches and to engage, as Maria's talked about and I've talked about, everything from manufacturing through materials, through the usage phase, through disposal, because there's a lot about the way products are made and used that you can inherently do and change and know is for positive and is carbon reducing, even without access to the most precise data. But if you look at some of the ACT label database products, you'll see information that will maybe help you with some of these questions as well.
Great. All right, let's jump into our next question. We have a couple of minutes left here. So our next question asks, what specific feedback mechanisms are in place for continuously improving the ACT eco-label standards based on evolving scientific and environmental data?
I guess that's another one for me. So yeah, so as I mentioned, I think in answer to an earlier question, ACT has always been and continues to be what we call a stakeholder-led program. So in the background, there is a continuous improvement mechanism whereby we have people from manufacturers, people from procurement, scientists from the lab, technical experts, and everything from manufacturing through to recycling and material sourcing and all that, contributing to an ongoing process of continuous improvement around ACT. And if you keep an eye on ACT in the coming years, you'll therefore, as I've hinted at, see it develop to, as you brightly say, align with latest scientific understanding, information, etc., and practice in this area.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, our next question here, Maria, we're going to jump back over to you. This question says, the part about pipetting errors was interesting. Do you happen to have any materials or documents that explain the topic in more detail and how to avoid errors in general?
Yeah, definitely. We have plenty of material on our website, for example, explaining more about different pipetting techniques and things that you should take into consideration. We also have a wonderful source of information and training called the Pipetting Academy, which is actually a certified training program. And this is a very beneficial program for everyone, whether you are a beginner in the lab or if you are really a seasoned professional in pipetting. So everybody can learn something new from this program. I actually myself worked in a lab for way over a decade, and I still learned new things from it. So I really can highly recommend. So if you just Google Sartorius Pipetting Academy to learn more, and I think you can also download a leaflet about the Pipetting Academy from this webinar page.
Yes, exactly. That is going to be directly beneath the webcams, just above the Q&A inbox that was provided to us by you. Thank you so much, Maria. Our next question that we have here, back to you, Raj. It says, what do people think when they see the ACT label?
So I think I'd kind of go back to what I think I said in the presentation about ACT. Just remember, ACT is an acronym. So what we hear and what we hear from people and what we hope and drive towards is that people see what the acronym stands for. So as I said, it's about manufacturers demonstrating accountability for the environmental impact of their products, and most importantly, accountability for working to drive that impact down over time. They see something that is consistent. We hear words like greenwashing, for example, in all industries at the moment when it comes to green things and sustainable things. ACT is designed to be the opposite of that. The consistency part, the C, is about it being a third-party verified, externally measured, standardized approach, which means you can be reassured that this messaging, this info you're receiving is comparable, standardized, and verified. And the third letter T, transparency, that what people are seeing is that they're seeing manufacturers and vendors who are open and honest about what they're great at when it comes to product sustainability, but also maybe what they're not so great at, but importantly, they're on a journey of improvement towards. And it's always good, I think, to embrace people on a journey of improvement versus those who won't even share the information with you or can't tell you what the answer to the question is.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And we have time to squeeze in just one more question here. This question's for you, Maria. It says, when it comes to the recycling of the waste from making pipette tips, can you explain more what happens to that material and where does it go next?
Yeah, sure. So we have actually partnered up with a local recycling company that comes regularly to collect all the production plastic waste. And this plastic waste is then crushed and regranulated. And then it's basically repurposed for making other plastic items such as buckets and boxes and these sort of things. So the plastic waste gets a new life, basically.
Love that. Wonderful. Thank you again, Raj and Maria, for your time today and your important research. We would also like to thank LabRoots and our sponsor, Sartorius, for underwriting today's educational webcast. Before we go, I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today and their interesting questions we did not have time for today, and those submitted during the on-demand period will be addressed by our speakers via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.